Good evening. How's everybody doing? Great to be learning with you on a Tuesday, Yom Shlishi. Let's light up the darkness. Today is my grandmother's yahrzeit, the anniversary of her death. That would be 26 years ago. Her name was Magda. Her Hebrew name was Sarah Bat Shmuel. She was a massive influence in my life. My grandmother survived the Holocaust, carried my mother as an infant through the Theresienstadt concentration camp, lost her husband in the war, who was murdered at Dachau. And so she always lived with us, was just such a big part of my growing up. She was sweet. She was very funny. She made Hungarian pastries and goulash that were absolutely amazing. And she just believed in me and in my brother, and just loved us and supported us so much. She was Hungarian. In 1956, settled back in Hungary after the Holocaust, after the war, and finally got out of Europe in 1956 during the Hungarian rebellion against the Soviet Union. She ended up in Chile with my mother, who at that time was 12 years old, and Magda managed to learn Spanish in Chile, but she never really learned English once we moved to the United States. And kind of one of our favorite stories actually happened to my brother, not to me. But he left his lunch at home in high school. And, for our grandmother, that her grandson would miss lunch. No, impossible. So off she went, walked, not a short walk to his high school. My parents had moved in the meantime, so we went to different high schools. And, without a word of English, and I don't think there was anyone in that area, probably spoke Spanish in the office, and certainly not someone who spoke Hungarian. But she came in, brought the lunch, made them understand, that it was my brother's lunch and that it needed to be delivered to him. And maybe the people in the office just got a kick out of it, because rather than, take the lunch from her, or maybe she wouldn't allow that, she wanted to deliver it personally. So all of a sudden, my brother, mid-morning is like sitting in his, his English class or social studies. And there's our grandmother at the door of his classroom with his paper bag lunch. At any rate, I'd like to dedicate our learning today to my grandmother Magda, Hebrew name Sarah Bat Shmuel. And may her neshama, I know her neshama has a tremendous elevation in the world of souls, but may it ascend even a little higher in the merit of our learning today. Who's in the house? Yehuda in South Carolina, Joseph in Massachusetts, Sharon in New Jersey, Shandora in the Bronx, Joe in the Inland Empire, Bill in mid-Missouri, Paul in the Great Northwest, Bella in Florida. And I hope everyone who's in the path of the hurricane, I guess West Coast and Panhandle of Florida, may everyone be safe. Jonathan in sweltering Southern California. It has been warm. Larry in Queens. Paula in Chicago. Belle in North Texas. Lucy in Minnesota. Melissa in Great Neck. Ryan in Jacksonville. Right. May you be safe. Karen in Northern California. Yehudit. And Paula and Melissa all saying amen for the wish from my grandmothers. Aaliyah, thank you so much. Elisa, shalom. Marjorie in Virginia. Marie in Freeport. Welcome, everybody. Our daf today is Tes Zion, page 16, here in Tractate Kiddushin, the 20th volume of the Talmud. We're continuing our discussion of Mishna number 2 in chapter 1. And discussing slavery as it was practiced in the ancient world. And we've been talking quite a bit about the obligations that a master had toward the Hebrew slave, and some of the obligations that the slave had to the master. But certainly this notion of slavery was revolutionary in the ancient world. We've talked a lot about the Hebrew slave. Certainly, as all tribes take care of their own, as it were, the Hebrew slave had more rights, many more rights, than the Canaanite slave, right? The Canaanite slave was much more akin, the Hebrew slave was much more like an indentured servant, usually for a period of 6 years or less. The Canaanite slave was a slave, the way we understand slavery, permanent slavery, really considered like property of the master, much as slavery was practiced throughout the ancient world. And yet, today we'll see that even the Canaanite slave had rights that other slaves in other cultures and societies at that time did not have. Let us proceed. We picked this up near the top of page 16a. The Mishna teaches, a Hebrew slave can be acquired by his master through money or through a document. And the Gemara asks, from where do we derive that he can be acquired through a document? Ula said, the verse states with regard to a Hebrew maidservant, right, a female slave, if he takes himself another wife, Exodus 21:10, and the verse thereby juxtaposes a Hebrew maidservant to another woman who is betrothed. And just as that other woman can be acquired by her husband through a document, as we learned in the Mishna number 1, so too a Hebrew maidservant can be acquired through a document. And the Gemara asks, well, this works out well according to the one who says that the master writes the document of a Hebrew maidservant, just as a betrothal document is written by the husband. But according to the one who says that the father of the Hebrew maidservant, you can kind of imagine what kind of crushing poverty people would have to be in, where a father sells his daughter, his minor daughter and his young daughter, prepubescent daughter, to be a servant in somebody else's household. There's not too many parents that would do such a thing unless, they were pressed in some very difficult way. But at any rate, this works out well according to the one who says that the master writes the document of a Hebrew maidservant, just as the betrothal document is written by the husband. But according to the one who says that her father writes it in the manner of a document of sale, what can be said? According to that opinion, the document of a Hebrew maidservant is not similar to a betrothal document, right? A betrothal document, one of the ways of creating betrothal is that the prospective husband says to the prospective wife, do you agree to become my wife? Yes, I do. Okay, so I will write a document of betrothal and hand it to you in the presence of witnesses. And he writes that document, just as later, if they get married and then decide to divorce, he will write for her the document of divorce, the get. But if we're saying that it's the girl's father who's selling her as a maidservant, that he would write the document, how can you learn out the law of the document that creates a maidservant from the law that creates that creates betrothal when it's different parties in doing the writing? I mean, in either case, she doesn't write the document, but in one, the prospective husband writes it, and in the other, the prospective father writes it. The husband is more akin, it's the household that she's going into. She's going into the husband's household, or she would be going into the master's household. But if the father of the girl is the one writing the document, that's the person whose household she's leaving. How can we compare these two laws? Right? So according to that opinion, the document of Hebrew maidservant is not similar to a betrothal document. As it is stated that Amoraim, the rabbis of the Gemara period, disagreed about this matter. With regard to the document of a Hebrew maidservant, who writes it? Rav Huna says the master writes it. Rav Chisda says the father writes it. Now this works out well according to the opinion of Rav Huna, but according to the opinion of Rav Chisda, what can be said? How can you compare betrothal by document to creating a maidservant by document? So Rav Acha Bar Yaakov said that this law is derived from a different source. The verse states, right, we're deriving that it is possible to create, the servitude of a Hebrew maidservant via a document. We already saw that the father can literally sell the girl's, it's not forever, right? But he's selling the girl's earnings, like the girl's work, for a certain amount of time. So he can do that with money, and we've already derived that. But how do we know that he can do it with a document? So, says Rav Acha Bar Yaakov, we look at a different verse. The verse states, with regard to a Hebrew maidservant, she shall not go out as the male slaves do. Exodus 21:7. Meaning when she leaves her servitude, she doesn't leave in the same way that a male Hebrew slave will leave. And one can infer, but she can be acquired in the manner of the acquisition of Canaanite male slaves. And what is this mode of acquisition? It is a document. Now the Gemara asks, but one can say, so I'm sorry, when she's being compared, it says she shall not go out as men slaves do. She's being compared to Canaanite male slaves, not Hebrew male slaves. So the Gemara asks, but one can say that the inference should be a different one. But she can be acquired in the manner of acquisition of Canaanite male slaves, and that is this mode of, and what is this mode of acquisition? It is possession. Now, possession is the way that the Koren Talmud is translating chazaka. Chazaka is a very interesting word. It sort of means based on what has been, we have a presumption of what will be. Right? And so in the same idea, like possession is 9/10 of the law. Okay, well, it's in this person's possession, so he has a chazaka. We are going to presume that he's actually the owner of it. This is in certain situations. It's not that possession creates this all the time. But we also use that word, for example, in a joking way, like if somebody comes to our minyan 2 weeks in a row or 3 weeks in a row, we would say, oh, you've created a chazaka, like now it's presumed that you're going to keep coming because you've created that pattern. That's the word, that word chazaka is also used. It's related to chazak, which means strength. And so, it's like you've created a strong presumption. But here they're translating that word as possession. And so the Gemara explains. So what she can be acquired in the man, but we could draw the comparison to Canaanite male slaves in a different direction, right? She can be acquired in the manner of the acquisition of Canaanite male slaves rather than go out in their manner. And what is this mode of acquisition? It is possession. And the Gemara answers that one cannot interpret that verse in this manner. As the verse states with regard to Canaanite slaves, and you shall bequeath them to your children after you. Right? When the master of a Hebrew slave dies, the slave goes free. In certain situations, certainly if he doesn't have a male son, the slave goes free. But Canaanite slaves endure from generation to generation. So they are like property that is inherited. And so it says in Leviticus 25:46, and you shall bequeath them to your children after you, which indicates that you can acquire only them, Canaanite slaves, through possession, right? Your father owned them, so you'll own them, like an inherited tract of land. But other slaves cannot be acquired through possession. And the Gemara asks, but if so, one can equally say that they, Canaanite slaves, can be acquired through a document, but others cannot be acquired through a document. How are we going to draw this link between the two laws? And the Gemara answers, isn't it written, she, the Hebrew maidservant, shall not go out as the men slaves do? And this is explained to mean that she, like other slaves, can be acquired through a document. Right? She's acquired in a similar way through a document, but she goes out in a different manner. So the Gemara asks, since these two verses can be explained in either manner, what did you see that led you to compare a Hebrew maidservant to a Canaanite slave with regard to being acquired with a document? And what led you to differentiate her from a Canaanite slave with regard to acquisition through possession? Perhaps the opposite should be the case, i.e., she is similar to a Canaanite slave with regard to possession, acquisition through possession, and different from him with regard to acquisition through a document. So the Gemara answers, it stands to reason that a document should be included in the acquisition of a slave, as a document is powerful in that it can release a Jewish woman in the form of a get, a bill of divorce. And the Gemara rejects this argument. On the contrary, possession should be included, as it can affect acquisition in the case of the property of a convert who died without leaving heirs, whereas no other mode can be used to acquire such property. And what they're referring to is that when a non-Jew converts to Judaism. Okay, so he becomes a Jew like any other Jew, or she becomes a Jew like any other Jew, full-fledged in every way. Now, to be a full-fledged Jew in every way means that, legally speaking, you no longer have your parents. It's not that they're dead to you. You can maintain a very beautiful, loving relationship with them. But your Hebrew name, for example, let's say that the convert, takes on the Hebrew name Yosef when he converts, so his parents who are not Jewish don't have Hebrew names. So his name becomes Yosef ben Avraham Visara, right? The parents, a Jewish name always refers to the parents. And so the parents of a convert are always Abraham and Sarah, right? The parents of all Jewish people, as it were. So legally speaking, his relationship is broken with his former family. It's not that anyone is encouraged to shun their family, but if this person who now becomes a Jew, if he gets married and he has children, okay, if he marries a Jewish woman and then they have children, so they are full-fledged Jews in every way, and they inherit property from him when he dies. But if he dies childless and unmarried, because his wife would inherit, but if he dies childless and unmarried, so then legally he doesn't have heirs. So that property becomes ownerless property, and it can be acquired in the same way that other ownerless property is acquired. So here, why are we talking about that law? So the Gemara answers, it stands to reason that a document should be included in the acquisition of a Jew. Wait a minute. Where am I? On the contrary. There's so much explanation. Right, it's here. Yeah, right, exactly. I'll just start this paragraph again. So, it stands to reason that a document should be included in the acquisition of a slave, as a document is powerful in that it can release a Jewish woman in the form of a get, right? She can go out of marriage via a document, and she can go into marriage via a document in terms of betrothal. And we're making a comparison between the laws of the Hebrew maidservant and the laws of betrothal. So we're saying that she can be acquired through document, right? But the Gemara rejects this argument. On the contrary, possession, right? Canaanite slaves can be inherited, right? The possession travels across the generation. And the Gemara, on the contrary, possession should be included as it can affect acquisition in the case of the property of a convert who died without leaving heirs. Whereas no other mode can be used to acquire such property. You don't purchase such property because it's ownerless. You don't acquire such property through a document because there's no one to give the document to. That property is ownerless. So basically, whoever takes hold of it, finders keepers, right? And that's why, in this sense, possession creates acquisition for ownerless property. And in this case, the convert who died without heirs. So the Gemara answers, nevertheless, with regard to marriage in any event, one does not find acquisition by means of possession. Possession is not relevant in the area of marriage, betrothal, divorce, etc. So if you wish, you could say it, and therefore we're not going to extend the law of possession to the law of slaves. But the Gemara answers, nevertheless, with regard to marriage, one does not find acquisition by means of possession. Or if you wish, say a different answer. It is to that end, i.e. to determine in which way to compare a Hebrew maidservant to a Canaanite slave, that the verse, quote, if he takes another, is effective, as it indicates that the acquisition of a Hebrew maidservant includes a mode of acquisition used in betrothal, i.e. a document. What this elaborate proof was just to show that a maidservant can be acquired for money or can be acquired with a document, right? The father it's not that he maybe doesn't want to sell the daughter. Maybe he just wants to place her in the home of a very kind family where, maybe she has to help wash the dishes and stuff. It doesn't mean she's going to be worked like a slave. It's going to mean that she's going to become formally and officially a part of that other household, which might be much better for her than the household that she's leaving. And so instead of selling her, as it were, they might just come to an agreement, her father with the father of the household that she's going to join, and they just draw up in a document to formalize that acquisition of her as a maidservant. Okay. And now the Gemara asks, okay, well, what about Rav Huna? Right, there was a difference between Rav Huna and Rav Chisda. Right, Rav Huna said, who writes the document for the acquisition of a maidservant? The master. And Rav Chisda said her father writes it. So now we're referring back to Rav Huna. So the Gemara asks, and Rav Huna, what does he learn from this verse, she shall not go out as the men slaves do? And the Gemara answers, he requires that verse to teach that she is not released on account of an injury to the extremities like a Canaanite slave. If a master injures one of her limbs, she is not emancipated, as explained in greater detail below. Unlike the Canaanite slave. Let me tell you, if any person, Jew, Ethiopian, Indian from India, any person in the world, or a fellow Roman, right, had become enslaved to some, rich Roman nobleman in ancient times, and the Roman nobleman got angry at the slave and injured the slave, and maybe threw a knife at him or something, and the poor slave lost a finger or part of a finger. Yeah, so the slave would have absolutely nothing to do about that. No recourse, no authority that he can go and complain to. It's like tough luck. But under Torah law, if a Canaanite slave were to be injured by his master, he would go free at that very moment and talk about a life change. He might lose a limb, terrible, but would go from destined to be a slave for the rest of his life, and if he has children, they're going to be slaves too, to you go free. You are an absolutely free person. So that was a right given to slaves, maybe not used very often, but a right that existed, that the Torah granted, that didn't exist before in the world. But the Hebrew female maidservant doesn't go free. Now, she's going to go free when she reaches puberty, if she finishes her 6 years, if her master dies, if her master marries her. There's many other ways in which she goes free. But getting injured in one of these ways, that is a law that doesn't apply to her. It only applies to the Canaanite slave. So Rav Huna is saying she shall not go out as the men slaves do. This shows that she does not go out if she is injured in this manner. And Rav Chisda, from where does he derive this law? Rav Chisda, who said that it's the father who writes the document that creates the servitude. Now, what is he learning out from shall not go out as the men slaves do? And the Gemara answers, if so, that it is teaching only one law, let the verse write, she shall not go out as the men slaves. What is the reason for the additional term, as the men slaves do? Conclude two conclusions from it. She is not freed due to injured limbs, and like a slave, she too can be acquired by means of a document. She's compared to the Canaanite slaves in the way she enters servitude. She's different from them in the way she leaves slavery. Now, the Mishna teaches, and a Hebrew slave can acquire himself after 6 years of work. And the Gemara cites the source for this law. How do we know that this is so? Well, the Torah says explicitly, 6 years he shall labor, and in the 7th he shall go free for nothing, meaning he doesn't have to pay any money to go free. Exodus 21:2. The Mishnah further states that a Hebrew slave is emancipated in the Jubilee year, which came every 50 years. And the Gemara explains that this is as it is written, he shall labor with you until the Jubilee year, Leviticus 25:40. So meaning even if he had been indentured, for 6 years, but in the second year of those 6, the Jubilee year arrived on the calendar, for everybody, he goes free. The Jubilee frees all the slaves. The Mishnah teaches that a Hebrew slave can be freed through the deduction of money. Meaning, let's say that the Hebrew slave, sold himself into slavery because he was destitute. Or perhaps even the court sold him into slavery because he couldn't make restitution for his theft. But then someone, a cousin shows up and gives him a bunch of money so he can purchase his freedom. I don't know about the slave who was sold by the court. I'm not sure about that. But the one who sells himself, he can definitely purchase his freedom. What's it going to cost? Well, whatever he sold himself for to go into slavery, minus pro rata for the years that he's already worked, he can purchase his freedom. That's called the deduction of money. So the Mishnah teaches that a Hebrew slave can be freed through the deduction of money. And Chizkiah says that the reason is that the verse states. How do we know that this is so? Because the verse states, Exodus 21:8, then he shall let her be redeemed. Speaking about the Hebrew maidservant, which teaches that if she acquires money and wishes to be emancipated before her time is complete, she deducts the value of the years that she has not yet worked from the cost of her redemption, and she is emancipated. Now, the same law applies to a slave. A Tana taught, and a slave can acquire himself with money, with an item worth money, and with a document. Right, a male slave versus a maidservant, both cases Hebrew. Now, the Gemara comments, granted, he can be acquired through money, as it is written, out of the money that he was bought for, Leviticus 25:51. Likewise, it is also clear that he can be acquired with an item worth money. As the Merciful One states, he shall give back the price of his redemption, which serves to include an item of monetary value, which is considered like money. That's what's called the price of his redemption. In other words, any item of value can be used to redeem a slave. But with regard to this document mentioned here, what are the circumstances? If we say that the slave wrote a promissory note for his own money, well, that is the same as money. What is the difference between the two cases? Rather, this is referring to a document of manumission, right? A slave can enter slavery, a Hebrew slave can enter slavery through a document and leave through a document. What is the document? The document of manumission by which the master frees the slave. And the Gemara asks, why do I need a document for this purpose? Let the master say, in the presence of two witnesses, go. Alternatively, let the master say before a rabbinic court, go. Right? Now it's been witnessed. Why does he need to write a document in that situation? He freed the slave in the presence of witnesses. That should be enough. Rava says that this is to say that the body of a Hebrew slave is owned by his master, and that this is not merely a monetary debt. And in the case of a master who relinquishes his deduction, i.e. the money that the slave must return for the years he has not yet served, his deduction is not relinquished. Although one can relinquish a monetary debt verbally, this is insufficient to release a slave whose body is owned by his master. A document is required to effect his freedom. Now, the Mishnah teaches that a Hebrew maidservant has one mode of emancipation more than a Hebrew slave, as she acquires herself through signs indicating puberty. Right? So we're talking about a young girl who is, sold or is acquired into servitude by a family. But when she becomes a young woman, right, when she reaches puberty, that's the end of her servitude. Where are we? As a Hebrew maidservant acquires herself from the master. I'm sorry. Where am I? Yes, the Mishnah teaches that a Hebrew maidservant has one mode of emancipation more than a male Hebrew slave has, as she acquires herself through signs indicating puberty. Reish Lakish says a Hebrew maidservant acquires herself from the master's authority not only through reaching puberty, but also through the death of her father. Right? Her father, who made this arrangement that she should go be a servant to this other family, if her own father dies, that servitude ends. And how does Reish Lakish know this? He derives it through a kal v'chomer inference. If signs indicating puberty, which do not release her from her father's authority, as, although she develops signs of puberty, she remains under her father's authority with regard to certain matters, nevertheless, release her from the master's authority, Is it not logical that death, which releases her entirely from her father's authority, because he's dead, should also release her from her master's authority? Now, Rav Hoshaya, so this is according to Reish Lakish, that not only reaching puberty ends her servitude, but also the death of her own father, who put her in that situation. Now, Rav Hoshaya raises an objection from the Mishnah. A Hebrew maidservant has one mode of emancipation more than a Hebrew slave, as she acquires herself through signs indicating puberty. And if it is so that she also acquires herself through the death of her father, as claimed by Reish Lakish, well, then the Mishnah should also teach that she is released through the death of her father. It should have said that a Hebrew maidservant has two modes of acquiring herself that are not available to the male slave, the male Hebrew slave. And the Gemara answers, the absence of an explicit statement is not proof, as the Mishnah taught one difference between a male slave and a maidservant and could have omitted others. It doesn't mean that the Mishnah says she has one more mode of acquiring her freedom than a male slave has, that she has only one more mode than the male slave has. It might mean that she has at least one more. We can't say that there is only one, and that would disprove Reish Lakish's interpretation that she actually has two. We haven't disproved Reish Lakish's claim just because the Mishnah said she only has one mode of release available to her that the Hebrew male slave does not have. So the Gemara asks, well, if you're saying that the one who drafted our Mishnah might have omitted other means of release that are not mentioned here, not only that her father died, but maybe something else. So the Gemara asks, well, what else did he omit that he omitted this? Right? If there's, you can say, if he says she has one more mode of release that the male slave doesn't have. Well, if there were 3 or 4 more, okay, he might have left all of those out because he was trying to stress one thing, that there's one more available to him that's not available, one more available to her that's not available to male slaves. But if there was truly only one other, why would the guy writing this Mishnah, the Tana of the Mishnah, omit that, right? If there's 2 and only 2 available to a Hebrew maidservant that's not available to a Hebrew male servant, you would expect that he would have said she has 2 modes of release that are not available to the male Hebrew slave. But he said 1, right? So the Gemara is challenging this. What else did he omit that he omitted this? And the Tana would certainly not leave out only one law. Maybe he would leave out a group of laws, but not just one. So the Gemara answers, the Tana omitted the death of the master. In the event of the master's death, the Hebrew maidservant is emancipated and is not inherited by the master's heirs. Well, the Gemara rejects this suggestion. If it is due to the death of the master, that is not an omission. The reason is that since there is also a similar law with regard to a man, i.e. a pierced slave, the slave who chose to remain a slave even after his 6 years were up, and the Mishnah does not teach that case. But if so, the question remains. Rather, let it teach that she is emancipated through the death of her father. Why was that not included? And the Gemara answers, the Tana of our Mishnah teaches a matter that has a set time, and it does not teach a matter that does not have a set time. For example, the death of her father, which there's no expected time when that will happen. Who knows when that will happen? So the Gemara raises a difficulty, but there is the case of signs indicating puberty. These do not have a set time, as a young woman may exhibit these signs of puberty at different ages, and yet it teaches this mode of emancipation anyway. So Rav Safra says, admittedly, these signs have no maximum set time, as once she reaches the age of 12, she is emancipated whenever she develops these signs, whether they show up when she's 13 or 14 or 15. But they do have a set time with regard to the minimum age at which these signs are taken into consideration. In other words, there is a lower limit, as any signs of puberty below the age of 12 for a girl are ignored. If she shows signs of puberty before she's 12, it doesn't matter because she hasn't reached puberty legally until the minimum age of 12. And with regard to a boy, it's defined a little differently, as we'll see. As it is taught in a baraisa, everyone agrees with regard to a 9-year-old boy who developed 2 hairs in a place, that this is not considered a sign of adulthood, as they are treated as hairs that grow on a mole. and don't mean anything about the stage of life. From the age of 9 years and 1 day until the age of 12 years and 1 day, even if they are still on him and have not fallen out, this is still considered hairs on a mole and do not indicate that adulthood is starting. Rabbi Yosef, the son of Rabbi Yehuda, says it is a sign indicating puberty between the ages of 9 and 12. Once he becomes 13 years and 1 day old and he grows 2 hairs, everyone agrees that this is a sign indicating puberty. Now, Rav Sheshes raises an objection. It is taught in Baraisa that Rabbi Shimon says there are 4 ways of emancipating slaves, and when they are emancipated, one grants them a severance gift. Now, we're not actually talking about the severance gift yet. What we're talking about is what we're going to learn out from this particular Baraisa, that we're going to read all of it and then see how does this bear on the question of, does the Hebrew maidservant have one means of release from servitude available to her that is not available to the Hebrew male slave, or 2 means or more? Right, that's what we're really inspecting. So let's see what is included within this Baraisa about the severance gift. Right, so Rav Sheshes raises an objection. It's on the Baraisa, the Rabbi Shimon says there are 4 different ways of emancipating slaves. And when they are emancipated, one grants them a severance gift. Of these, 3 apply to a man, meaning a Hebrew slave, and 3 apply to a woman, meaning a Hebrew maidservant. And you cannot say that there are 4 ways for either one of them, because there is no emancipation through signs indicating puberty for a man, and there is no emancipation through piercing the ear for a woman. Consequently, there are only 3 modes of emancipation for each. We are on 16b now. And the Gemara clarifies the difficulty. And if it is so that a Hebrew maidservant acquires herself through her father's death as claimed by Reish Lakish, let him teach also that a Hebrew maidservant is emancipated at the death of the father. And if you would say, here too he taught some differences between a Hebrew slave and a Hebrew maidservant and omitted others, this cannot be the case. As he teaches, there are 4 ways of emancipating slaves. The mention of a number indicates that there is a set number of ways. And if you would say that the Tana of that Baraisa teaches a matter that has a set time, it does not teach a matter that does not have a set time, as there is a law of signs indicating puberty which do not have a set time, and nevertheless he teaches it. And if you would say that here too, this is in accordance with the opinion of Rav Safra, that signs have a minimum set time, there is still the death of the master, which does not have a set time, and yet he taught it. So the Gemara answers, the death of the master is not taught either, i.e. this mode of emancipation is not counted among 4 modes mentioned in the Baraisa. Again, keep in mind, what they keep challenging here is when a Mishna or a Baraisa was formulated to say that there are 4 ways of doing something, and there are 4 ways of emancipation for a male slave and 4 ways of emancipation for a female slave. Does that mean those are the only 4 ways that either one of them can be emancipated? If there are other ways, why were certain methods of emancipation left out of that list? It sounded like it was exhaustive, but it isn't. So what was the philosophy of the Tana for omitting certain laws? From that, we'll learn, this one that we're wondering about, that Reish Lakish says that the death of the father frees the maidservant. We don't know if that's the law yet or not. And so we're trying to figure out from the way that the Mishna and the Baraisa are formulated. So the Gemara asks, but if you do not count the death of the master, what are these 4 methods? And the Gemara answers, a Hebrew slave or maidservant is emancipated, 1, after serving 6 years and in the Jubilee year, even if it occurs within those 6 years, and 2, the Jubilee year itself emancipates the slave even after the act of piercing a Hebrew slave's ear with an awl extended his term of slavery by his choice, and a Hebrew maidservant is emancipated with signs indicating puberty, right? Okay, so both of them go free after 6 years. Both of them go free if the Jubilee year arrives during their servitude. The Jubilee year will also end the slavery of a man who had his ear pierced and remained enslaved. That doesn't apply to Hebrew female slaves because they don't have the option to pierce their ear and remain enslaved past the 6 years of servitude. And for the Hebrew maidservant, when she reaches puberty physically, she is freed by that, but that doesn't apply to the male slave. So the Gemara adds, so too, it is reasonable that this is the correct interpretation of the Baraisa. As it teaches in the last clause, you cannot say that there are 4 modes for either one of them, because there is no emancipation through signs indicating puberty for a man, and there is no emancipation through piercing for a woman. And if it is so that the death of the master is included, in the case of a woman at least, you find 4 ways that she can be freed. 6 years of service, the Jubilee year, signs of puberty, and the death of the master. But the Baraisa said the ways that are listed, only 3 apply to the female or 3 apply to the male. Neither one of them has 4. So the Gemara comments, conclude from the Baraisa that this is so. Now we know that the death of the master frees her. The question is, why wasn't it included in this list? So Rav Amram also raises an objection against the opinion of Reish Lakish from a Baraisa. And there are the slaves to whom one grants a severance gift. One who leaves through 6 years of service, and one who leaves in the Jubilee year, and one who leaves through the death of the master, and a Hebrew maidservant released by signs of puberty. All of these receive a severance gift when they end their servitude. And if it is so that she is emancipated through her father's death as well, as claimed by Reish Lakish, this Baraisa should also teach that she is released by the death of the father, and it didn't teach that. So this would be a good argument that Reish Lakish was wrong. And if you would say here too that this Tana who drafted this Baraisa taught some differences between a Hebrew slave and a maidservant and omitted others, well, he included the word these. These are the ways, right? These are the slaves to whom one grants a severance gift, which indicates that this law applies only to a slave freed in these ways, but not to slaves freed by other ways. And so maybe, right, does she go free if her father dies? Maybe. Does she receive a severance gift? Presumably not. But that doesn't prove that she doesn't go free if her father dies. And if you would say that the Tana teaches a matter that has a set time and does not teach a matter that does not have a set time, but isn't there the case of signs of indicating puberty, which do not have a set time, and nevertheless he teaches it? And if you would say that what he omitted because he taught in accordance with the opinion of Rav Safra that signs have a minimum set time, well, there is the death of the master, which does not have a set time, and yet he taught it. Therefore, this is a conclusive refutation of the opinion of Reish Lakish, and the Gemara affirms the refutation of the opinion of Reish Lakish is indeed a conclusive refutation. The girl does not go free from servitude because her father died. The father made that arrangement. Now she's a servant to this other family. If her father dies, she doesn't go free. If her master dies, she goes free. If she completes the 6 years, she goes free. If she reaches puberty, she goes free, but not because her own father died. The Gemara persists, but the ruling of Reish Lakish is based on a Kal V'chomer inference, and nothing has been said to contradict his reasoning. You might say, well, his law was not included in any list of laws about why she goes free, but has anybody refuted Reish Lakish's Kal V'chomer inference? And the Gemara answers, the Kal V'chomer inference is refutable because it can be refuted in the following manner. What is unique about signs indicating puberty is that they indicate that her body has changed, and perhaps she is emancipated because she is now considered a different person. Will you say the same with regard to the death of the father? As her body, she herself has not changed just because she became an orphan when her father died. Recall that under Jewish law, if either of your parents dies, that makes you legally an orphan. Now, it is taught in one Baraisa, the severance gift bestowed upon a Hebrew slave when he is emancipated is given to the slave himself. And the severance gift bestowed upon a Hebrew maidservant is given to the maidservant herself. And it is taught in a different Baraisa, the severance gift of a Hebrew maidservant and any lost items that she finds belong to her father, and her master has only the reimbursement for her lost time. He has paid the money that he would have earned if she had been working instead of carrying home the items that she found, but he doesn't get them, right? Her father gets them. So the Gemara suggests, what? Is it not correct to say that the difference between the two Baraisas is that this Baraisa, which says that the severance gift is given to her father. This is referring to when she leaves through signs indicating puberty, as she is a young woman and still under the authority of her father with regard to certain matters. And this other baraisa, which states that the severance gift is given to her, is referring to a case when she leaves through the death of her father. Since she does not have a father, she keeps the severance gift for herself. This explanation is in accordance with the opinion of Reish Lakish that she is emancipated through the death of her father. And it contradicts the conclusion of the Gemara that his ruling has been refuted, conclusively. But the Gemara rejects that argument. No! Both this baraisa and that baraisa are referring to a maidservant who left because she reached puberty. And it is not difficult. This baraisa, where she keeps the severance gift, is referring to a case where there is a father who can take the gift and it's given to the father. And this other baraisa is referring to a case where there is no father, i.e. he died before she developed the signs of puberty. In that case, she receives the severance gift herself. She didn't go free when her father died. She went free when she reached puberty, but because there is no father at that time, she keeps the gift herself. The Gemara comments, granted, one can understand the baraisa that taught that the severance gift of a Hebrew maidservant is for herself, as this serves to exclude the maidservant's brothers. These brothers do not receive the gifts after her father's death, as it is taught in the baraisa, and you shall bequeath them to your children after you, Leviticus 25:46. This verse indicates that they, Canaanite slaves, are bequeathed to your sons. They are inheritable property. But your daughters are not bequeathed to your sons. From here it is derived that a person may not bequeath his rights to profits generated by his daughter to his son. But it is obvious that the severance gift of a Hebrew slave is for himself. Rather, to whom could it be given? Rav Yosef said, well, I see here a small letter yud that has been made into a large city. In other words, although it's not necessary for the Tana to teach this law, he stated it out of habit, despite the fact that the ruling does not teach anything new, right? That a Hebrew male slave, when he finishes his servitude, he must be given, with a Hebrew master, he must receive a severance gift. And that severance gift goes to him, right? And so the Gemara is saying, why do we need to say that? That's obvious. Who else would we give it to? He's not under the authority of his father the way a maidservant might be. He's his own person. Who else would you give it to? He sold himself into slavery, or the court sold him. You don't do that with a minor, unless the father does it to the minor. But a minor can't sell himself, and the court doesn't sell a minor. So obviously, when this guy leaves servitude, the severance gift would go to him. What other choice is there? Abaye said that Rav Sheshes said like this. In accordance with whose opinion is this baraisa that we need to know the severance gift is given to him? It is in accordance with the opinion of the sage Tutai. As it is taught in a baraisa that Tutai says, the verse, you shall grant severance to him, Deuteronomy 15:14, indicates that it is given to a Hebrew slave, but not to his creditor. Right? It might be that the Hebrew slave owes money. So you might have thought, well, if he's being given a severance gift of money and he owes money to someone else, why don't we just give it to his creditor? No. He's the one who served in that household. He receives the severance gift. The creditor can come and sue him or, try to get that money, but it is not the business of the master to give that severance gift to anyone but the slave who served him. Now, the Gemara discusses the matter itself, and these are the Hebrew slaves to whom one grants a severance gift. One who leaves through completing 6 years of service, and one who leaves in the Jubilee year, and one who leaves through the death of the master, and a Hebrew maidservant who is released by signs indicating the onset of puberty. But with regard to one who flees from his master, or one who is released by deducting money, these one does not grant a severance gift to them. Rabbi Meir says, with regard to one who flees, one does not grant the severance gift to him. But in the case of one who is released by deducting money, paying, for his freedom, one does grant the severance gift to that one. I'm almost done. Questions or comments, please get them in. Rabbi Shimon says there are 4 different ways of emancipating a Hebrew slave, and when Hebrew slaves are emancipated, one grants them a severance gift. Of these methods, 3 apply to a man and 3 apply to a woman, and you cannot say 4 modes apply for either one of them because there is no emancipation through signs indicating puberty for a male slave, and there is no piercing for a woman. Right? She can't say that she will remain a slave after her years are up. She doesn't have that option. A man does. He remains a slave until when? Until his master dies or the Jubilee year comes. And in all those cases, he gets a severance gift when it ends. The Gemara asks, from where are these matters derived? The Gemara explains that this is as the sages taught. One might have thought that one grants a severance gift only to a Hebrew slave who was released after 6 years. From where is it derived to include that one grants a severance gift? Now the Torah says, and he shall not go out empty-handed. That's where the Torah says it explicitly. So now we know that a Hebrew slave who serves for 6 years, you shall not, when he goes out, he does not go out empty-handed. You have to give him the severance gift. From where is it derived to include that one grants a severance gift to one who left in the Jubilee year? Because he didn't finish his 6 years. And one freed through the death of the master. He didn't finish his 6 years. And a Hebrew maidservant who leaves through signs indicating puberty, because she didn't finish her 6 years. How do we know that even they receive a severance gift? The verse states, you shall not send him empty-handed. And when you send him, he shall not go out empty-handed. These phrases serve to expand the law of severance to include any Hebrew slave who is emancipated, because there's additional language that wasn't necessary. What do we learn out from that? That there's these other cases who also receive severance gifts. I might have thought that I should include a Hebrew slave who flees and one who is released through the deduction of money. Therefore, the verse states, and when you send him free from you, which is referring to one who was sent from you with your knowledge and consent. And this excludes a Hebrew slave who flees from his master and one who is released through the deduction of money, who are not sent away from you with your permission. They bought their freedom. You're forced to accept, but you didn't choose that as the master. Rabbi Meir says one does not grant the severance gift to a Hebrew slave who flees, as he is not sent away from you because he left on his own. But with regard to a Hebrew slave who is released through the deduction of money, who is sent from you, he is granted a severance gift, as this deduction payment requires the agreement of the master. So the master does have to agree to the deduction. That I'm not sure about, but at least according to Rabbi Meir, he has to agree, and therefore he also has to give a severance gift. Okay, let's go to questions or comments on Kiddushin 16. Load. Load, Google Doc, load. Okay, Jonathan, if the father has authority to approve or negate vows, or even make vows for them, no. A father can nullify the vow of his daughter on the day he hears of it, but he can't make a vow for her. I don't remember that. Then, when he sells his daughter as a maidservant, does the master now control the approval or negation? He has to approve a vow, ratify the vow. Very good. But he doesn't make the vow for her. Does the master now control the approval or negation of vows? That's a great question. I don't know. If she leaves her father's house and, he sold her or received a document from the new master, does that master also acquire the ability to nullify her vows for her? It would, on the one hand, you would argue, well, maybe she's not anywhere near her father's house. Maybe she's gone to another city, and it would certainly be more convenient for her master. Remember, it's a leniency for women that their fathers, when they live in their father's house, or their husbands, once they join their husband's house, can nullify their vows for them. A man doesn't have that ability. He has to seek out. A woman can do the same thing, but she has that extra ability to have a vow nullified. Vows are negative, right? Like, it's not a good thing to make a vow. The sages discourage it strongly, because if you make a vow and don't fulfill it, you made a transgression. That didn't exist for you if you hadn't taken that vow. So it's bad to take a vow, and if you do take a vow in a moment of emotion, it would be better to get out of it. So you'd have to go find a rabbi who's a competent halakhic authority who can find an out for you. Whereas a daughter living in her father's house or a wife in her husband's house can just go to them and say, hey, I made this vow. And he says, I nullify it for you. And she's done. She doesn't have to fulfill that vow. But does a master acquire that ability? I don't know. Great question. I don't know the answer. Jonathan also asks, we've been talking about a minor girl sold into maidservantry. What about a minor boy? And if so, and her body has changed at puberty, why not the young boy at 13 in a day? I mean, it sounds like that's not done. I don't know why. The father doesn't sell the minor boy into slavery. That's something that's done with the girls. I'm not sure why. But that hasn't come up. And it may be because the Torah says specifically that he sells himself, because his means don't permit, or, the court sells him because he stole and can't make restitution. And it talks about a father selling his daughter. It's also a way, by the way, to create, gets her out of the house, and she might end up being married to her master or to her master's son. So it's kind of like a way to set her up, at a higher strata in the society. But it doesn't talk about a father selling his son. So I don't know if that was possible or not. Linda Feldman. But if the Canaanite slave were so seriously injured that he could be emancipated, who was going to support him and his family in case he had one? The freedom benefited the master more than the former slave. Interesting. You're saying that if he was really maimed, so he's not going to be able to earn a living, how does emancipating help him if he's now going to be out there? Nobody's going to want him as a slave or as an employee. It might be difficult. Very good. Does he have the option to go free, or is it automatic? I'm not sure about that. It's certainly a benefit to him. Like this includes, I think, if he loses a tooth. Like if the master punches him and he loses a tooth, like that's enough. And losing a tooth is not going to hurt him that much in the rest of his life. But it's a great question if he's maimed. Now, an interesting thing there would be like if he's seriously maimed, that the master did that to him. So freeing him is going to be, a right that slave has. That slave, I think, will also have a right to damages. Right? I mean, if the master maimed him, okay, so then there's going to be loss of the limb, compensation for that, medical, humiliation, loss of livelihood, all kinds of other stuff that isn't covered necessarily under the law of emancipation, but would be covered under the law of damages. And that's what I've got for us today. With God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow at the regular time, 6 p.m. Pacific on Wednesday. Have a great evening.